You tell us when we're ready to go.
What can they throw?
Well, they can make comments, Simon. They're free to. All right, good to go. Last week's storms have seen hundreds of thousands of Victorian households and businesses go without power, and we know that there are still many thousands of Victorian households and businesses that are without power. One of the critical issues to come out of the hardship that Victorians experienced last week, and many of whom continue to experience even today and will continue in the coming days and weeks, is that so much of this could either have been mitigated or possibly even averted. We know that the Allan Labor government received a host of reports in the last 3 to 4 years about the reliability of our transmission network and ways and means by which the transmission network could be made more resilient as we see more and more storm events that cause fairly significant damage to households and businesses. We know that AusNet did reports, the energy regulator in Victoria did reports. We know that an expert panel commissioned by the Labor government in 2021 did a report. We know that as recently as November last year, Energy Safety Victoria undertook a report and identified a large number of instances where transmission towers were vulnerable because of structural defects or rust or other risks that could involve the breakdown of power generation or transmission in our state. The Allan Labor government has clearly been on notice about the fragility of Victoria's energy system and in particular the transmission network. Following the events of last week, I had hoped that Jacinta Allan and her government would come out clearly and indicate to the Victorian people that her government would conduct a root and branch review of where we're at, why previous warnings have not been acted upon, and which have now culminated in so many hundreds of thousands of Victorian households and businesses suffering in ways that they might not have had to if those warnings had been acted on. That's why the Liberals and Nationals this week in the Parliament will be seeking to form in the upper house an inquiry, a select inquiry into the events of last week and all of the surrounding issues. This inquiry is something that Jacinta Allan should be doing, but her government is not doing. So we will. We will look to join those in the upper house who are willing to join with us to make sure we take whatever steps are possible to avert these things happening in the future. It's not like they are infrequent events. We know these storm events are becoming more and more frequent, and people are suffering unnecessarily. The government needs to look at this, join with us in this inquiry, make sure that people are free to attend, free to speak without any kinds of inhibition so we can get to the bottom of why previous warnings have not been acted upon. That's clearly something that's owed to the Victorian people. As I've said, Jacinta Allan and her government should be doing this on behalf of all Victorian households and businesses. They're not, so we will. I'll hand over to David to say a few words.
Thank you, John. And I just want to reiterate that, in fact, Victorians have every right to expect secure, reliable and affordable power. Last week we saw a terrible set of incidents and outages, 530,000 Victorians without power. This is completely unacceptable, and we need to have a robust, secure, reliable transmission system, and we need to make sure that it's affordable. So this week in the Legislative Council, the opposition will put forward a proposal for a select committee to look at the reliability, security and durability of our distribution system. That will obviously look at the events of last week, but will look much broader than that. It will look at the issues around renewables and getting the electricity to the city fundamentally from a number of different locations. It will look at the issues around the cost of a number of these transmission lines and so forth. It will look at different options and make sure that we're in a position to go forward in a way that is going to meet those objectives of reliability, stability and affordability for our electricity distribution network. It'll be in the form of a select committee, and I make it clear today that Georgie Crozier and myself are very prepared to talk to the minor parties about the precise terms of reference. We'll propose one term of reference, and also the machinery of the inquiry. But if people have useful points to make, we would certainly be prepared to have those discussions. But the end result is there have been warnings There have been clear issues with the maintenance and the reliability of our distribution system. This inquiry is a way to look at those. As John has outlined, the wake-up calls that have occurred on several occasions through recent years make it imperative that there's an overall view on this and that we're actually empowered to look at this more broadly and to work out where the state should go. It's not a matter of pointing the finger. You know, in one instance, the state government ought to have managed this better, but it's also about going forward and getting a solution for Victorians in the long term.
Just in terms of the inquiry you're pushing for, in terms of reference-wise, would it only look into the energy aspect of last week's emergency, or are you looking more broadly at the week's events, which may also include what occurred, say, out of the moment?
It's not fundamentally about fire, if that's the point you're making. It's fundamentally about the energy issues, the long sweep of these warnings that the government has received, the issues about maintenance. I mean, the government's been empowered, it's in its 10th year now, and we know that there are maintenance issues. We know that there are a series of warnings that have been provided to government. Now, we've obviously also got a significant renewable input now, and we need to respond to that and make sure that there's a way to get that energy to where it's needed. At the same time, we need to not lose sight of the affordability objective, so we need to focus on that reliability, security of supply, and affordability.
Are you worried about security of supply for the transition to renewables? Is that what you're saying?
Well, we're saying that we don't believe the government has done the work. We don't believe the government has done the work in these things. So in a number of these key aspects, we know that there are issues with some of the long-distance transmission lines.
You're resisting a transmission line. Your SBO State Western distribution
well,
line.
The VNI...
opposing that. Isn't that about getting
that's actually not quite right. We have proposed a different alternative. But the point here is that there is real issues about the distribution network, both historically and where we are today, and indeed going forward. And this inquiry would, in a non-partisan way, be able to look at all of those aspects.
SBOsnet, amongst others, actually run the transmission and distribution networks. Should there be more onus on them to be upholding the maintenance standards? Should there be more emphasis on what they have and haven't done?
At the end of the day, it is the responsibility of the Victorian State Government to make sure that our distribution network is fit for purpose, that it's reliable, that it's secure, and it's affordable. That is the Victorian Government's responsibility. Now, there's a range of different operators, including the one you've mentioned, and they obviously do have responsibilities, but the framework and the ultimate responsibility rests with the state government.
Should the state bring it back under their control then?
I think that the state has got to make sure that there's an outcome there for Victorians. We need reliable, secure and affordable power. And at the moment, we know we don't have that. We've had huge surges in price in the recent period. We've had this unreliability problem that is now manifest. And we've obviously got a future with a range of different energy sources. So we need to make sure that our system is fit for purpose, and that is one of the tasks of this inquiry.
Just going back a step, are you certain that you'll get crossbench support to even get this?
I never take for granted my crossbench colleagues. All we can do as an opposition, where we don't have a majority in the upper house, is to propose ways forward. We are also, and I think what we're proposing is entirely reasonable. I think most Victorians, out on Burke Street today would think, oh my goodness, 530,000 people lost their power. A number still don't have power. There's a long history of problems here. This is something that's very central to Victoria's future that needs to be inquired into. Now, as I say, that doesn't mean that if a crossbencher has a specific point to make and wants to tweak the terms of reference or indeed the machinery of the motion, that we're unprepared to talk about that.
Is Parliament
a situation where you couldn't compel again ministers to attend the inquiry?
Well, the powers of a select committee are the powers of the House, and they are to obtain documents and persons to come and give evidence. And we would hope that that would, of course, never be necessary, that it would be appropriate for government ministers, for government officials, for private firms that are involved to come and give open and frank evidence. At the end of the day, we want to get to the bottom of these problems, and we want to make sure that we can go forward in a constructive way.
An inquiry such as this, would it at all fall within the scope of the IGEN? And obviously, it was an emergency situation. You've got you're inquiring into matters in terms of energy. The IGEM has certain powers to look at emergency response. Wouldn't IGEM potentially be an outlet for some
well,
of these?
only part of these terms of reference responds to the specifics of the day, and part of them respond to these longer term issues and to the future as well. So it's a terms of reference that I think sensibly looks at the past, the current issues, and indeed into the future.
Say the government has ignored previous warnings from other reviews. What's the point of having another inquiry that they could just potentially ignore?
Well, I think it's very different. A clear parliamentary inquiry that does have powers to make sure that relevant people come. That is rather different to a small inquiry that's conducted over to the side. And frankly, if I went again down Burke Street today, I would think very few people knew about those earlier inquiries. But they as sure as heck know now that we have a problem in the state with reliability and security of supply. And I think the last 18 months or 2 years mean many families and businesses understand that we've got a problem with the price, with the affordability of power too.
Other than putting everything underground, which the state can't afford to do, how else do we protect the system?
There's a number of again, this would not be my moment today to give all those answers. Part of the reason for the inquiry is to look at exactly those points. But we do know some things. We do know that there is a maintenance issue, and the materials that have been out over the last 2 days make it clear that there is maintenance issues across the system. We know that some of the high voltage towers are actually not fit for purpose. We know that now on 2 occasions there has been collapses that well, if you read the 2020 report, it's clear that they were not designed for the downdrafts. So,
Isn't that on AusNet though?
pardon?
Isn't that on both providers, not the state?
Well, it's ultimately the state government has to make sure that we've got a system that's fit for purpose. And at the moment it's not fit for purpose, and we need to work out a way forward for the whole state on this. And this is one way of doing it. It's an open inquiry, it's transparent, and this would provide that opportunity.
Can I say to that?
Yeah.
So, last week's, we've got our friend, it's like a pit stop. Look at him go. Look at him go.
It's the wheels.
Oh, there he goes. That was well done. Record time. Just wanted to add to David's comments, and he said it very well. I just wanted to add a few things. Last week's events will traumatise those directly affected for many, many years. They were serious incidents. I particularly went to Merbau North on Friday. I know the Premier did as well. And to see what local communities have to contend with now when massive trees, bigger than the one behind me, were ripped out of the ground by strong winds like matchsticks. People are dealing with the aftermath of that. Now, it's all well and good for Premier Jacinta Allen to say that her response to that are some packages of $1,900 and $2,900 for families and businesses. We welcome those, but they're not nearly enough. And what I want to say is that I had hoped that the government would be standing here where I am today announcing an inquiry like this. Instead, we are, because we're determined to make sure that we can learn the lessons of the failures of the last 4 years. And part of this inquiry is not just looking at what's happened, but finding solutions for people and for our entire community. We have a massive challenge in front of us, not only as part of the energy transition, but a massive challenge in making that distribution and transmission network far more resilient than it is at the moment. That's why the government should join with us. And I hope that Jacinta Allen will make available anyone who can assist in that effort in the upper house to find those solutions because Victorians need it.
John,
talked about-
given that she's not here today and they're not making this announcement today, and you disagree with the way they dealt with it in terms of bigger grants given on Friday, what makes you think they're going to turn up at all?
I hope the government will turn up, but if they don't, as expected, we're going to continue on. And as David and I have said, this inquiry is really important because it's not just about looking at the past, it's more importantly focused on the future and how we make our system more reliable and resilient. Our population is growing, our communities are growing, demand is growing. We need to make sure we have an energy system that is resilient but can also meet those growing pressures. Now, the government won't do it, but that doesn't mean we won't be committed to finding those solutions.
Talked about, you've both cited the transmission towers coming down. It cost $25 million to replace 6 in 2020. Can the state actually afford, any state government actually afford to replace all those transmission lines?
I think you have to look at particular regions and what is possible and practicable in a given region. In some parts, undergrounding might be possible. We know that in some parts it's simply not. We have to have a very considered approach to doing that. But in terms of the cost, let's put all this in context. The government says it's too much. It blew over $600 million on the Commonwealth Games debacle. Don't ever tell me that this priority cannot be met.
But this would be passed on when SP AusNet replaced those 6 transmission towers. They went to the AEMO and got permission to pass that $25 million straight back onto households. So it's a private network, so it's going to be borne by them. So it's ultimately going to come back to the households. Isn't that a concern to you that cost? You talked about affordability.
Yeah,
isn't that a concern for you that the affordability will be hit by everyone? It's
about priorities and managing Victoria's budget well. You might ask the same question. Who bears the brunt of the Commonwealth Games debacle? $600 million. Who bears the brunt of unnecessary cost blowouts on major projects? It's all about managing Victoria more responsibly with common sense approaches to managing the overall budget. So if it's necessary for government to intervene, it can do so in a way which improves the investment in resilience, but does so in a way which either doesn't affect households or minimises the impact on households. But we've got a government that doesn't seem to have the right priorities. It's willing to squander money on blowouts and Commonwealth Games cancellations, but then it's taking its eye off the ball of energy transmission and making sure we avoid the events of last week. I think you wanted to add to that.
I mean, there's obviously this is the purpose of the inquiry, to look at many of these exact issues. So I'm not wanting to prejudge where an inquiry like this would end up and prejudge it before we have all of the evidence. I think what the material that's out there now, and even the former Royal Commissioner speaking today makes clear, is that there is a problem, and that's got to be looked at systematically. At the end of the day, it's the Victorian state governments that is responsible, and the Victorian state government needs to put in place a regime that guarantees that reliability, security and affordability for households and indeed for businesses.
Question for John.
Yeah, sure.
John, will you release any and all returns you've made in regards to, in terms of register of interest, in regards to any donation that you received towards your legal fees in the defamation case on foot at the moment?
Yeah, I said that on the weekend.
And will you release documents in full?
Yeah, it'll be the required documents that the clerk of the Parliament requires, and also I'm not applying the threshold. So any contribution will be included, no matter how small.
And
so
is there a return that's current, that's actually been lodged with the Parliament prior to the returns that come in February?
Yeah, because I was awaiting advice from the clerk, the donations fall after the reporting date, but I'm nevertheless going to release that information at the same time, and I think that's next week, but it will be made publicly available.
Just on that, the point you said you're going to ignore the threshold for lack of a better argument. Do you think just generally that threshold should be lowered so that Victorians have a greater idea of what gifts MPs are receiving?
Look, I'll leave that for the clerks and the Parliament. My approach as leader of the opposition and alternative premier is that I'm not going to apply any threshold, so anything that's contributed will be part of my return.
Do you think Moira Deeming should do the same thing?
That's a matter for her.
What about...
Do you think the same standards? Over the same standards?
I'm not going to comment on any other member of
Speaking
Parliament.
of standards, just with register of interest and accountability, Is it time for these things to be known in real time rather than just a fixed point when members' interests are actually due to be submitted and then published? Why not some real-time reporting on this?
Look, I'm happy to have that discussion, Simon. I think one of the issues might be that you'd be having a rolling filing of lots of documents across the Parliament, right across MPs, but I'd certainly have no problem with it myself.
Just on a situation down in Geelong where a house is a government house, there's a big group of fine there, section hasn't been inspected for quite a long time. So what needs to be done to make sure those homes are inspected and safe?
Well, we know this is a tragic situation, obviously, and I think one of the challenges that we're seeing now right across Victoria in community services generally is that workers in the system working on behalf of the Victorian people have enormous caseloads. I am concerned about that. I'm interested to know whether that has affected the frequency with which homes are visited and clients of departmental support are managed and overseen. So I'd be very concerned about that. We know across other parts of community services, caseworkers are dealing with significant caseloads, and that can pose a problem, but I'd like to know more in this specific instance about that.
Just on, you don't know that? It's the same thing? No. Just on stamp duty, there are 28 foreign-owned businesses that have had their additional duties waived by the Allen government. Victoria pays the highest stamp duty in Australia. Is there some transparency that's owed to Victorians, and also what's your take on the government not wanting to release the businesses that have been exempt?
I think it's really unfair to Victorians that Jacinta Allen wants to conceal who gets the benefit of their dispensation from stamp duty. There are hundreds of thousands of Victorians, particularly home buyers, who are paying the highest property taxes in the country. We're paying overall the highest taxes in the country. We all, as Victorians, owe nearly $20,000 each, according to Victoria's total debt. So we're doing it the hardest financially. And for Jacinta Allen to think it's okay to secretly waive stamp duty for foreign investors when Victorians are paying the highest taxes in the country, that's just not fair and it's just not right.
E-bikes, just to really round this question.
Sure.
If you don't mind. So police can pull over people on e-scooters but not e-bikes. Does the same rule need to apply to both?
Absolutely. We've got more people riding on our roads today. We know they're riding e-scooters but also bicycles. I think it's really important that there be consistency of the law applied here, and people's safety is at stake here, not just pedestrians but the riders themselves. So I think there needs to be more uniformity across the enforcement of these laws. Thank you very much.
Thank you.